The twist in the tale. It had been a month since Mark discovered the telltale signs. His wife, Sarah, had been acting distant. Late nights at work, unexplained absences, and the sudden secrecy around her phone. He had seen the subtle shift in her behavior, the brief moments when her eyes darted away as if caught in a lie. It was all too clear. The rumors, the whispers in their social circle confirmed what Mark had feared. His wife was cheating, or so he thought. Mark had become a shadow. In his own home, waiting for the right moment to confront her. The tension gnawed at him, each passing day another knot tightening in his chest. But on the evening of the confrontation, Sarah was different. She was cool, collected, and calm as ever. No defensiveness, no argument. "I know," Mark said, his voice cracking with raw emotion, "about the affair." Sarah looked up, but there was no surprise in her eyes, only a flicker of something else. A faint smile played at the corners of her lips, not a smile of guilt or shame, but of victory. "I'm not the one you should be angry with, Mark," she replied softly, her voice smooth and measured. Mark froze, confusion flooding his mind. What was she talking about? "You think I've been unfaithful, but it was always part of the plan," Sarah continued. She leaned back in her chair watching him, her eyes full of a cold calculation that sent a chill down his spine. His heart raced. "What do you mean? Plan? What plan?" Sarah stood up and walked to the window, staring out at the moonlit garden. "You remember last year when I asked you to invest in that company? The one you thought was a sure thing? The one that turned out to be a scam?" Mark's blood ran cold. "What does that have to do with this?" "It has everything to do with it," she said, her tone almost pitying. "You were so sure you could outsmart me, control everything. But what you didn't know is I was already 5 steps ahead." Mark's mind scrambled. She had always been smart. But this was something else. "I didn't cheat on you, Mark," Sarah said, turning back to him. "I wanted you to believe I did. All of it, the late nights, the secret phone calls, the affair, it was to distract you, to make you see something that wasn't there so you'd let your guard down, so I could expose you." Mark blinked, disbelief and horror mingling within him. "Expose me? For what?" She took a slow, deliberate breath before answering. "For stealing from the company, for manipulating the financial records to cover up your fraud. You thought you could bankrupt me, ruin me without facing the consequences. But I had you pegged, Mark. I knew what you were up to." His face drained of color. "You're insane. That's impossible." "Oh, no," Sarah said, her voice almost soothing. "The evidence is all in my possession. You thought you could ruin me with your lies, but I was only waiting for you to make the first move, to accuse me of cheating. It gave me the perfect opening to turn the tables. Now you'll be the one exposed." Her words struck like a blow. Mark's heart hammered in his chest as the weight of her scheme sank in. He had been played. Every moment of jealousy, every accusation, had been orchestrated to perfection. "You're not going to get away with this," he whispered, barely able to speak. Sarah smiled again, this time with a chilling finality. "The difference is I already have." Mark stumbled back, his mind reeling. How could he have been so blind? The evidence she spoke of, it must be real. He had always assumed his own skills in finance would protect him, that no one would ever question his control over the companies, books. But Sarah had known all along. He had underestimated her at every turn. "Why?" he managed to ask, his voice cracking. "Why didn't you just leave me?" She tilted her head, her expression unreadable. "Because leaving would have been easy, Mark. I wanted you to feel the weight of your own decisions. I wanted to see the moment when you realized what you had done, when you understood that your own arrogance and greed would bring you down. You always thought I was the naive one, didn't you?" Mark opened his mouth, but the words caught in his throat. The betrayal, the humiliation. It was all crashing over him like a tidal wave. He had built his empire on lies, buried deep within the intricate web of his own deceit, and now it was unraveling before his eyes. "Did you ever love me?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. Sarah's eyes softened, but only for a moment. "At one point, yes. But love is a fragile thing, Mark. And when it's betrayed, when it's taken for granted, it dies. I had to become something else, to survive, to outsmart you, to make you see the truth." Mark shook his head, trying to make sense of everything. "But why let me get this far? Why not stop me earlier?" "Because you needed to destroy yourself. I couldn't make you stop until you had taken everything. It wasn't about vengeance. It was about justice. You had to lose everything before you could understand what you had done to me." She stepped closer, her voice now low and almost gentle. "I made sure you would believe the affair was real, that you would obsess over it, track every move, every phone call. I fed you every little piece of doubt, every shred of evidence to keep you blind to the truth. And while you were focused on that, I had time to secure everything you thought you controlled." Mark's mind whirled, his pulse racing. "The company, everything," she nodded slowly. "I've already contacted your partners. They're waiting for the right moment. The fraud charges you thought you had covered up, well, the evidence is already with the authorities. I'll be free of your lies, Mark, free from everything you built on my back." Suddenly, the room seemed to close in around him. The walls felt as if they were closing in, the very air thick with his suffocating realization. He was trapped. Everything he had worked for, his wealth, his reputation, his future, had been carefully dismantled while he was chasing shadows. And now it was too late to fix any of it. "But there's one last thing," Sarah said, her voice taking on a darker, more dangerous edge. Mark's eyes flicked to hers. "What?" Sarah's lips curled into a wicked smile, the light in her eyes flickering with a gleam of satisfaction. "I never did it alone." Mark's heart skipped a beat. What was she saying? She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small black envelope. It was sealed, the letters scrawled in a familiar handwriting. Mark's face went pale as he recognized the name. "No, it can't be." "Your best friend Greg," Sarah said, her voice laced with malice. "He helped me with everything, the company's accounts, the fraud, and you thought you were the one pulling the strings." Mark's mind reeled as the truth hit him. His closest friend, Greg, had been working with Sarah, feeding her information, helping her plan every step of his downfall. The one person he had trusted above all else. "Greg?" Mark whispered, his voice shaking. "Why?" Sarah shrugged, a look of cold amusement in her eyes. "The same reason as you, Mark. Power, money, revenge." Mark's world tilted on its axis. The betrayal ran deeper than he had imagined. It wasn't just his wife, his partner in crime. It was the very people he had relied on to stay above suspicion. "So now," Sarah said, her voice taking on a finality that made Mark's blood run cold, "you've got nothing left. No company, no friends, no wife, and soon enough, no freedom." She took a step back, her face hardening. "Enjoy the rest of your life, Mark. It's going to be a long, lonely one." As she turned to leave, Mark finally spoke the words that had been burning in his chest. "You've won, Sarah. You've taken everything." Sarah paused just before walking out the door, and for a brief moment, there was a flicker of something. Maybe sympathy. Maybe just the faintest hint of regret. But then, she was gone, leaving Mark standing in the dark, the pieces of his shattered life scattered across the floor like broken glass. And in that silence, he knew one thing for certain. The game was over, and he had lost. Mark stood frozen, his mind racing, yet unable to process the full extent of what had just unfolded. The crushing weight of Sarah's words, the twisted reality she had carefully crafted, It was more than just a betrayal. It was a masterpiece of manipulation, a web spun so intricately that even he, with all his experience, hadn't seen the threads. His legs buckled and he sank into a chair. The room around him was a blur. He could barely breathe. It wasn't just the loss of the company or his future that tormented him. It was the complete and utter disillusionment of everything he thought he knew. The people he had trusted, the life he had built, had all been lies. His mind kept circling back to that name, Greg, his best friend, the man who had been by his side through every major decision, the person he thought he could always count on, even when the stakes were high. And now, it turned out he had been playing him the entire time. The phone buzzed in his pocket, and he startled as if pulled from a nightmare. His hand trembled as he pulled it out, his eyes still not fully able to focus. It was a message from Greg. "We need to talk. Now." Mark's stomach turned. No, this can't be happening. It can't. His hands were slick with sweat as he dialed Greg's number, his heart pounding in his chest. The phone rang once, twice, a third time. Finally, Greg picked up, his voice casual, almost too casual. "Mark," Greg said, sounding as though they were about to have a regular conversation. "We need to figure this out. There's a lot we need to discuss." Mark's voice came out in a low, unsteady growl. You've been a part of this, haven't you? You've been working with Sarah all this time." Greg was silent for a beat. Mark could hear the faint sound of rustling in the background, the tapping of a keyboard, like Greg was trying to act like nothing had changed. Then he spoke, his tone still smooth, but with a faint edge that Mark didn't recognize. "Look, Mark, it's not what you think. It never was. But I need you to understand, this was always bigger than both of us. Sarah's right. You were never going to get away with it." Mark's mind raced faster now, his pulse hammering in his ears. "What the hell are you talking about? You were my friend. You helped me do all of this, everything, and now you're turning on me? For what? Some twisted game you two cooked up?" Greg sighed. There was something almost pitying in the sound. "You've got it all wrong. You were the one who played the game, Mark. The game of power, of control. The problem is, you didn't see who you were really up against. Sarah isn't just your wife. She's been planning this for years. She's smarter than both of us combined." A sickening realization gnawed at Mark's gut. For years? Wait, this has been going on for longer than just a few months? This whole thing was planned from the beginning? Greg's voice dropped a notch as though speaking to someone who finally understood their fate. "She saw through you a long time ago. She knew you were going to slip up. She knew you'd get greedy. That's why she waited. And when she had the evidence, when she knew she had you cornered, that's when she pulled the trigger." Mark felt as though the floor was giving way beneath him. "And you were just the pawn she used to get what she wanted?" Greg chuckled, but there was no humor in it. "I was never a pawn. I played my own game, Mark. This was never just about Sarah getting back at you for your lies. It was about us both getting something we've always wanted. Power." Mark clenched, his fists, his mind struggling to keep up with the speed of the conversation. The betrayal was so deep, so intricate, that every word felt like another wound in his already broken soul. "I don't understand," Mark whispered, his voice barely audible. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because," Greg said coldly, "you weren't supposed to know. You weren't supposed to understand until it was too late. You were always too blinded by your own ambition to see what Sarah was capable of. You were the one who played everyone else, Mark, and now it's your turn." A chill ran down Mark's spine. "So what happens now?" Greg didn't answer immediately. When he finally spoke, there was an eerie calmness to his voice. "Now, you lose everything. Everything you thought you had control over is slipping through your fingers. Your empire, your reputation, your friends, everything you've built, with lies is coming undone. Mark's mind spun, but through the confusion, one thought began to solidify in his chest. It wasn't over. Not yet. You think I'm done, Greg? You think Sarah has already won? Mark's voice was suddenly filled with a dangerous edge. You're wrong. I still have one card left to play. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Then Greg's voice, almost amused, replied, You think you can outplay us, Mark? You think you have something we didn't already account for? Mark's eyes narrowed as a sudden, brutal clarity struck him. Mark's heart pounded in his chest as he stood up, feeling a surge of adrenaline rush through him. The cold, overwhelming weight of the situation had pushed him to his breaking point, but something within him, something buried beneath the lies, the manipulation, and the betrayal, had ignited. He had been played, yes, but he wasn't finished. Not yet. His mind raced with ideas, strategies, ways he could turn the tables. He couldn't undo what had been done, but he could make them pay. He could make Sarah and Greg understand that there was one thing they had underestimated: his will to survive. The first step was getting his hands on the evidence. He had to act fast. If Sarah had already contacted the authorities and the partners, the noose was tightening around him. But if he could get ahead of her, if he could find a way to manipulate the situation before they made their final move, he might still have a chance. His phone buzzed again. A message from Sarah this time. It's done. The paperwork's already filed. It's too late for you. Mark's jaw clenched as he read the words. His fingers hovered over the screen, but then he stopped himself. No. He couldn't let his emotions control him anymore. He needed to think. Taking a deep breath, Mark glanced around the room looking for anything that might give him an edge. There, on the desk, his old computer. He hadn't used it in months, but it still had access to all the company's sensitive files. His first instinct was to go straight to the office, hack into the financial systems, and erase the trail that had been left behind. But there was a bigger risk with that. If he made one wrong move, they'd know instantly. Instead, he needed to be smarter. He needed to outthink Sarah and Greg. Think, he urged himself. What would Sarah do next? His mind flickered back to that last conversation with Greg. The way he had spoken so confidently, so assured. He had sounded as though everything was already in place, but there was one thing that didn't add up: Greg's arrogance. He'd been too sure of himself. That was a mistake. Greg had underestimated one key element: Sarah. Mark had always believed he understood her, knew how she thought, how she operated. But Sarah's true nature had been hidden beneath layers of manipulation, deceit, and most dangerously, patience. She hadn't just been playing a game, she had been waiting for the perfect moment. But now it was his turn. He picked up the phone again, dialing the one number he had yet to call. His lawyer, Anne. She had been his ally through countless business dealings, always sharp and reliable. She was the one person who could help him now, if she hadn't already been compromised by Sarah's scheme. The phone rang, and after a few beats, Anne's voice came through. Mark, what's going on? I just heard about the mess you're in. You need to get in front of this before it blows up. His voice was low and urgent. Anne, I need your help. And I need it now. Sarah and Greg, they've set me up. They've got everything planned. But I need to know. Can we move quickly enough to take control of the narrative before they ruin me completely? Anne paused for a long moment. Okay, she finally said. Tell me everything. And this time, don't leave anything out. Mark quickly recounted everything. The fraud, the affair, the manipulation, and the final betrayal. He didn't hold anything back. When he was finished, Anne spoke in the calm, collected way that always reassured him. We can fight this, Mark, she said, her voice sharp. But you need to understand, this is going to get dirty. We're talking about massive financial fraud, public humiliation, and a whole lot of people who will be looking for blood. But we can get ahead of Sarah's move. I'll need you to get me access to your financial records. Everything. And I need it yesterday. Mark's heart raced, but he nodded resolutely. I can do that. But there's one more thing. We need to be prepared for anything. If they try to destroy me, I'm not just going to sit back and let it happen. Anne's voice softened. I know you, Mark. You're not one to roll over. We'll fight back. But we need to move quickly. Don't make any rash moves until I give the go-ahead. Mark knew what that meant. He needed to stay calm, stay patient, and wait for Anne to do what she did best. But as he stared out the window, the storm inside him was far from over. His mind was already working overtime, calculating his next move. The game had shifted, and Sarah's victory lap was premature. He would find a way to expose her, to expose both of them. But more importantly, he would make them regret underestimating him. As he gathered the last of the evidence he could find, files, records, emails, anything he could use to turn the tide, he heard the sound of a car outside. His pulse quickened. Someone was here. Was it Sarah? Greg? He rushed to the window and saw a familiar face walking toward the front door. It was Anne, her expression grim but determined. Anne stepped inside, her presence like a storm front breaking over the tense air. She was methodical, precise in her movements, her sharp gaze scanning the room as though already calculating the next steps. Mark, still reeling from the emotional onslaught, felt a rare moment of clarity. With Anne's help, this could work. Okay, Mark, Anne said, setting down her briefcase on the table. Let's get to it. First, we'll need a full audit of everything you've got. Company records, personal accounts, the whole shebang. Sarah and Greg won't be expecting this. Mark opened the laptop and began pulling up files, but his mind wasn't entirely focused on the work in front of him. He couldn't shake the feeling of unease. There was something more to this, something bigger than even Sarah's elaborate plan. Greg's involvement was one thing, but the way he had spoken, that casual confidence, it felt off, too smooth. Mark couldn't ignore the nagging sense that something else was at play. He glanced at Anne. I think there's a bigger piece to this. Sarah might have orchestrated the fraud and the affair, but Greg, he's been acting like he's always known this was going to happen, like it was his plan too. I don't know if she was just a pawn for him. Anne's brow furrowed, clearly weighing the possibility. You think Greg's pulling the strings here too? Mark nodded slowly. Maybe he's been more involved? Then I realized. Maybe Sarah wasn't the mastermind after all. Maybe they've been playing a longer game, one I didn't see until it was too late. Anne didn't respond immediately. She was quiet for a moment, her fingers tapping on the edge of her briefcase, clearly thinking through the implications. Then she straightened up, her voice firm. We can't operate on assumptions, Mark. We need proof. We need evidence that links Greg to the larger scheme. If you're right, and he's been playing both sides, that changes everything. But let's focus on the here and now. We'll look for inconsistencies, anomalies, anything that doesn't add up. The key is getting ahead of them. Mark opened the company's internal financial records and began scanning them. He was used to the numbers, but the truth was that they had always been Greg's domain. It was Greg who had managed the investments, the hidden accounts, the offshore assets. Mark had trusted him, and that had been his biggest mistake. Anne was already at his side, her fingers flying over her phone as she typed furiously. I'm reaching out to a few contacts who can trace Greg's financial moves. If he's been laundering money or skimming off the top, we'll find it. But we also need to make sure we've covered our tracks. They'll be watching, Mark. They'll expect you to make a move, and we need to make sure it's one they won't see coming. Mark swallowed hard, the gravity of it all finally hitting him. They'll be watching. They had been playing him all along, and now he was in their sights. Every decision, every move had to be calculated, or it would be his downfall. Just as he was about to pull up Greg's personal financial records, Anne's phone buzzed, cutting through the silence. "I've got something," she said, her voice now tinged with a sharp urgency. "It's from a source in Greg's company. We have confirmation that Greg and Sarah had been in contact with offshore accounts. Money was moving right under your nose, Mark. They've been siphoning off funds for months." Mark's stomach twisted. "Offshore accounts? Where?" he asked, his pulse quickening. He could already feel the tides turning. The pieces were beginning to fall into place. Anne pulled up a set of encrypted files on her laptop, her eyes scanning rapidly. "I can't get full access yet, but there's one thing that stands out. The transactions were routed through a shell company, a company you've never heard of, and it's tied directly to Greg's personal accounts." Mark's chest tightened. So Greg wasn't just an accomplice. He was the architect. He slammed his fist on the table, frustration and anger building to a fever pitch. "Damn it! He's been running the show from the start, using Sarah as a distraction while he set everything up. I've been blind to it." Anne looked at him, her face calm but resolute. "We need to move fast, Mark. If they catch wind of what we've found, they'll shut it all down. The key is making sure we get ahead of them." Mark nodded. His mind was working overtime now, all his instincts screaming that he couldn't afford to wait any longer. If Greg had been the mastermind, he needed to expose him, fast. The only way to do that was to hit him where it hurt the most, his personal assets. Mark opened a secure browser and pulled up the company's records, ready to make his move. As he did, he noticed a strange pattern in the financial transfers. Several large sums had been sent to an account tied to a name he didn't recognize. "Anne, take a look at this," Mark said, his voice tight. "This doesn't make sense. Who is this?" The air in the room seemed to thicken with the weight of Mark's realization. His hands hovered over the keyboard, the pulse of his own heartbeat in his ears louder than ever. He had suspected that something much larger was at play, but now, with this shell company and the connection to someone from his past, it was all becoming too clear. Anne was already on her phone, her eyes narrowing as she checked her contacts. "If this corporation is really a front for something bigger, then you're right. We're not just dealing with Greg and Sarah anymore. This could go much deeper than we ever anticipated." She stood up and started pacing, her mind clearly racing through the implications. Who from your past? Who could have this kind of reach? Mark's jaw clenched as the name surfaced in his mind, one he had hoped to never utter again. "Victor Calderone," Mark muttered, the name tasting like ash on his tongue. Anne froze, her phone still pressed to her ear. "Victor Calderone?" she echoed slowly, her eyes widening. "You're talking about the same Victor Calderone who ran the cartel in Miami, right? The one who disappeared years ago?" Mark nodded grimly. "That's the one. I thought he was dead. But if he's been pulling the strings behind this shell company, then everything changes." Victor Calderone was a name Mark had buried in the darkest corners of his memory, a criminal mastermind whose reach had extended far beyond simple illegal transactions. Calderone had been the leader of an empire, one that had been built on smuggling, money laundering, and political manipulation. Mark had once been involved in a shady business deal with him years ago, a deal that had nearly cost him everything. When Victor had vanished without a trace, Mark had assumed it was over, but now it seemed like Calderone had been laying low, waiting for the perfect opportunity to resurface, and this whole scheme, with Sarah and Greg at the helm, had been that opportunity. They weren't just pawns in a game, they were mere players in a much larger, far more dangerous plot. Anne's voice broke through his thoughts. "If Calderone's involved, then we need to rethink everything. This isn't just corporate fraud anymore. It's organized crime. It's going to take everything we have to stop it." Mark's eyes sharpened. "I know. But if Calderone is pulling the strings, we can't just go to the authorities. Not yet. He's too powerful. We have to move carefully." Anne paced a few steps back and forth, her mind working through the layers of the mess they were now knee-deep in. We need more proof. We need to know how Calderon's been funneling money through the shell company and who his partners are. If we can expose that, we can dismantle the operation piece by piece. But we have to be smart about it. They'll be watching, Mark, and we can't afford to make a misstep. Mark stood up, pacing, his mind running on overdrive. The more he thought about it, the more pieces fell into place. Calderon had been hiding in plain sight, using people like Sarah and Greg as tools, leveraging their ambition and greed to fund a massive operation. They were expendable. To him, they were just another means to an end. But I'm not expendable. The thought came to him with sudden clarity. He turned to Anne, determination in his eyes. We can't wait any longer. We need to move fast. Calderon will try to cover his tracks, but if we can get to the source, if we can expose the network he's been using, we can bring him down. This needs to be a public exposure, a scandal big enough to crush him. If we don't do it soon, we'll be buried in the fallout? Anne nodded, her expression steely. I agree. We need to isolate the key players, get the records on the offshore accounts, and use them against Calderon. He might have been playing the long game, but so have we. They worked late into the night, piecing together everything they had. Anne used her connections to trace the flow of funds through the shell company, uncovering more accounts, more names. The deeper they dug, the more they realized just how extensive Calderon's operation truly was. The money was moving through multiple countries, masking itself as legitimate business transactions, and Greg and Sarah were at the heart of it. They were the ones keeping the wheels turning, unaware that they were just pawns in a larger game. By the time the first light of dawn crept through the blinds, Mark and Anne had assembled enough evidence to make a move. It wasn't enough to take down Calderon just yet, but it was enough to get the attention of the right people, the kind of people who could start pulling the strings on the other side. We need to go public, Anne said, her voice low but sure. We have to leak this to the press, get it in front of the media, and then we'll take the next step. If we wait any longer, Calderon will disappear again, and this will all be for nothing. Mark nodded. Let's do it. They made their plan. The next few hours felt like a blur of calculated decisions and rapid movements. Anne and Mark worked tirelessly to put the plan into action. Anne used her contacts in the media, getting the story to the right journalists, ensuring the leak would make waves. Mark, meanwhile, meticulously crafted the final piece of evidence, a damning trail that would tie Greg and Sarah directly to Calderon's network. The offshore accounts, the shell company, the illicit transactions, everything they had uncovered was in place. It was just a matter of hitting the button. But as the minutes ticked by, a dark weight settled on Mark's shoulders. This wasn't just about exposing fraud anymore. It was about survival, about exposing Calderon for the monster he was. He had seen the destruction Calderon had wrought before. If they didn't act fast enough, they could become part of the wreckage. Mark's phone buzzed. It was Anne. Mark, they're coming for you. Greg's been in contact with someone. He knows we're on to them. Mark's heart stopped. How do you know? Anne's voice was laced with urgency. I've got a friend on the inside. Someone in Greg's circle tipped me off. They've already started scrambling. It's not just about the money anymore. Calderon's been watching too. He knows you're digging, and now he's trying to erase the evidence before it gets out. Mark clenched his fists, feeling the sharp sting of betrayal cut deeper. He had underestimated how far Greg and Sarah were willing to go to cover their tracks. They had already crossed the line into danger, and now they were ready to burn everything, to keep their involvement hidden. We need to move, Anne. Now. He didn't wait for a reply. The air around him felt suffocating as he rushed to his computer, securing all their files and making sure everything was ready for the leak. But the thought of being exposed, of being dragged into a scandal that could cost him everything, was beginning to gnaw at the back of his mind. If the public learned the truth about Calderon's cartel and Greg's betrayal, there was no telling how far the consequences would reach. The doorbell rang. Mark froze. His pulse quickened as he moved toward the window, peering through the blinds. There, standing outside in the dim light, were two men in dark suits. They weren't from the press. This wasn't a coincidence. Greg's people, Mark muttered under his breath. They're here to shut us down. He grabbed his phone, dialing Anne in a panic. They've found us. You need to get out of there. They'll be looking for you too. They can't trace this back to us. Anne's voice was sharp and calm on the other end. Don't panic, Mark. You're not alone in this. If they're here, it means they're desperate. We can use that against them. Just make sure you've got the evidence locked down. Keep them talking until I can get someone to help you. Before Mark could respond, he heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps in the hallway, the door handle rattling as it was tested. The intruders were already inside. Mark's mind raced. He couldn't. Let them take the evidence. He couldn't let them silence him now, not when they were so close to winning. A sharp knock on the door. Then a voice, cold and authoritative. "Mark Thompson," the man called from the other side. "We need to talk." Mark's grip tightened around his phone. He could feel his heartbeat thumping in his chest as he backed away from the door, trying to stay out of sight. He couldn't let them in, not without exposing their true motives. He grabbed the flash drive containing the crucial evidence, the one that could destroy Greg, Sarah, and Calderon. It was the only thing keeping him from being buried alive in their lies. With a deep breath, Mark quickly shoved the drive into the back pocket of his jeans, just as the door creaked open. "Mr. Thompson?" One of the men stepped inside, his voice firm, carrying a sense of authority Mark instantly recognized as dangerous. The other man stayed by the door, scanning the room. "We need to talk about your recent activities." Mark stood tall, his voice cool and measured despite the adrenaline coursing through him. "I don't know what you're talking about. I'm not interested in whatever you're selling." The man didn't flinch, stepping closer. "This isn't a negotiation, Mr. Thompson. You've been interfering in matters far beyond your comprehension. The sooner you realize that, the better for everyone." Mark's mind was racing. "I can't let them intimidate me, not now." "So what?" Mark said, his tone challenging. "You're here to threaten me into silence? Is that your play?" "The man's lips curled into a thin smile. "We're offering you an opportunity, Mr. Thompson. You can walk away from this, go on with your life, before things get messy. All we need is for you to hand over everything you've found. The files, the evidence, all of it. If you cooperate, we can make sure this stays quiet. No one has to get hurt." The words hung in the air, but Mark knew the truth. Mark's breath came in ragged gasps as he sprinted down the narrow alley behind his house, the dark figures of the men in suits already closing in. His mind raced, calculating the best way to escape. They were fast, and there was no telling how many more of them were lurking in the shadows. But his only option was to keep running, straight for the car parked a few blocks down, where he had hidden a second phone and a burner laptop. He had one shot at getting the evidence out. His thoughts were a blur of urgency as he rounded a corner, skidding to a stop when he caught sight of the car. The engine hummed softly, waiting for him. Just as he made a break for it, he heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind him, faster now, closer. He could feel the weight of his own panic settling in. If they got their hands on him now, it would all be over. Just a few more steps, Mark thought, his legs screaming with the strain of the run. He reached the car, flinging open the door and diving inside, slamming it shut behind him. The engine roared to life, and Mark gunned the accelerator, peeling away from the curb. But the moment his foot hit the pedal, he saw headlights in the rearview mirror. Too many. They were right behind him. Mark's mind worked quickly, considering his options. He was being hunted, but he wasn't out of tricks yet. The burner laptop was already on the passenger seat, and he wasted no time in setting it up. His hands shook as he booted it up, pulling up the encrypted files that contained everything he had learned about Calderon's network. The identities, The money transfers, the cartel's reach. It was all there. This was his weapon. But just as he was about to upload the files to a secure server, his phone buzzed. "Mark!" It was Anne's voice, strained and panicked. "Get to the drop point. They're tracking you. You've got maybe 5 minutes before they lock you down. Get out of sight and—" The line went dead. Mark's heart pounded in his chest. He knew what that meant. They've got her. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. Anne had been helping him, risking her own life to expose Calderon's operation. She couldn't be captured now, not when they were so close. Mark had to save her, even if it meant throwing caution to the wind. Without a second thought, he veered off, the main road cutting through the winding back streets. His plan was reckless, but time was running out. He couldn't afford to wait and hope Anne had enough time to disappear. If they had her, the stakes were even higher now. They were playing for keeps. He swung the car around a sharp corner, heading straight for the drop point Anne had mentioned. It was a secluded spot, away from prying eyes, where he'd arranged to meet with a trusted contact, a hacker who could help them breach Calderon's inner circle. If he could just get to that meeting, he'd have the leverage he needed to save Anne and make sure the files went public. The car screeched to a halt in front of a weathered warehouse, its dim lights barely illuminating the desolate parking lot. Mark jumped out of the car and scanned the area, his nerves frayed. He couldn't see anyone, no sign of Anne, no sign of his contact. His phone buzzed again, this time with a single text from Anne. "They have me. Don't come get the evidence. Out. Trust no one." Mark froze, his blood running cold. She was already in their hands. And the worst part? He realized that she had known this was coming. She had known all along that Calderon's people would be after her, after them both. He clenched his fists, the bitter taste of betrayal rising in his throat. No, he couldn't lose her. He wouldn't. As Mark stood there scanning the empty parking lot, a figure emerged from the shadows. A man dressed in black, his face obscured by a mask. The hacker. "Mark Thompson?" the man asked, his voice low and gruff. Mark didn't hesitate. "Where is Anne?" The hacker's eyes narrowed behind, his mask as if calculating something in his mind. "She's not here. But I have what you need." He held up a small encrypted hard drive. "Take it," the hacker said, tossing the drive to Mark. "Get the evidence out before they find you. I've done my part, but you need to hurry." Mark caught the drive, his fingers trembling slightly. "Where's Anne?" The hacker didn't answer immediately. When he did, his voice was softer, almost sympathetic. "You're running out of time, Mark. I can't help you with that. You need to decide. Save her or expose Calderon. You can't do both." Mark stared at the hacker, the weight of the decision settling over him like a lead blanket. The files. Anne. Calderon. He had been playing catch-up this entire time, and now, with his back against the wall, the reality of it hit him. He couldn't save them both, not at the same time. He had one shot left, just one chance to take Calderon down and expose the cartel's operation. But Anne was in danger. If she was captured, everything they had worked for would be lost. And worse, she could be killed. The engine roared as Mark floored the accelerator, tearing out of the parking lot, the encrypted hard drive burning a hole in his pocket like a ticking time bomb. His heart raced, not just from the physical speed, but from the mounting weight of everything that was at stake. He had to make it out of the city, get the files into the hands of someone who could help him. But every corner, every turn, felt like it could be his last. The city lights blurred into a haze as he raced down empty streets, but his thoughts were consumed by Anne. She had been the one person who had stuck by him through everything, the one who had warned him when the walls were closing in, the one who had put herself in harm's way for the sake of exposing Calderon. Now he was on his own, forced to reckon with the consequences of a betrayal he never saw coming. She knew, he thought bitterly, gripping the steering wheel tighter. She knew it was coming. She knew they'd come for her. Anne had always been careful, methodical in her approach, and for good reason. They had both known the risks from the beginning, but somewhere along the way, Mark had allowed himself to believe that he could outsmart the system, outmaneuver Calderon's empire. But Anne had been right to anticipate the endgame. She had known the real cost of playing in Calderon's world. She had given up her life, her safety, to get the evidence out, to ensure Calderon would finally be exposed. But in doing so, she had become a pawn in a game far bigger than either of them had ever imagined. As Mark navigated the roads, the weight of that truth settled like a lump in his throat. She's gone now. I can't save her. Not right now, but that didn't mean he couldn't make them pay. Mark's phone buzzed, the sound of it nearly making his heart skip a beat. He quickly glanced at the screen. It was a message from the hacker, the last person who had handed him the crucial hard drive. It read simply, "They're coming for you. They know you have the files. You've got less than an hour before they trace you. Run! Now!" His blood ran cold. They were close, too close. He slammed the phone down, eyes darting around for any signs of surveillance, but there was no time to think. Mark pulled into an underground parking garage, finding a secluded corner where he could hide the car. He couldn't afford to make any more noise, to risk attracting attention. The only thing that mattered now was getting the files into the right hands, making sure that Calderon's reign would finally end. Mark took a deep breath, gathering himself, then quickly unbuckled his seatbelt and grabbed the encrypted hard drive. He headed for the elevator, praying he wasn't being followed. If he could just make it to the contact he had in mind, the one person he knew could pull the strings and get the evidence into the right hands, then he might just have a chance at bringing Calderon down. But even as he moved through the dimly lit garage, his mind raced with thoughts of revenge. "You betrayed me, Greg," he thought, the anger simmering in his chest like molten lava. "You used Anne. You used me. You thought you could play me. And now, the only thing left to do was make them feel the weight of that betrayal." There was no going back, not after everything that had been lost. Mark entered the elevator and pressed the button for the top floor. As the doors closed, he felt the weight of what was coming, his last chance to destroy everything that Calderon had built. But revenge was never clean. It was never simple. It always left something broken in its wake. The elevator dinged, and the doors opened onto a sleek, modern office suite. Mark didn't waste a second. He strode in, his mind focused on one thing only, the drive. But the moment he stepped inside, he froze. There, standing by the large glass window with a glass of whiskey in hand, was someone he had never expected to see. Greg. Mark's heart sank. The betrayal was more than just an abstract idea now. It was flesh and blood standing right in front of him. Greg turned slowly, a smirk curling on his lips. "I thought you'd be a little more cautious, Mark," he said, his voice smooth but with an edge of menace. "You really think you could get away with it?" Mark's jaw tightened. "You never should have crossed me, Greg." Greg raised an eyebrow, the amusement in his eyes turning to something darker. "It was never personal, Mark. You should have understood that from the start. This whole thing, this game we've been playing, it's all about power. You're just a pawn. And, too, a means to an end." Mark took a step forward, his fists clenched at his sides. "You used us, both of us. You manipulated her, and now you're going to pay for it." Greg chuckled darkly. "That's where you're wrong. You were never going to be the hero in this story. You and Anne were just stepping stones. And now I have the files. The cartel is untouchable. Calderon's empire will rise and you'll be forgotten." Mark's mind was a whirlwind of emotions as he sat in his car, parked on a quiet street a few blocks from his house. The evidence of Sarah's infidelity, still fresh in his mind, gnawed at him like a persistent itch. He had always trusted her, believed in their marriage, but the truth was undeniable. Her betrayal stung deeper than he could have imagined. He had thought about confronting her directly, but something inside him knew that this wasn't the time for that. He needed answers. Real answers. Not just half-truths or excuses. So, he made a choice. He hired someone who could dig deeper than he ever could on his own. A professional. Mark had found Peter Callahan, a private investigator and lawyer with a reputation for uncovering the truth, no matter how dark or complicated it was. The moment they met in Peter's office, Mark knew he had made the right decision. The lawyer's sharp eyes and confident demeanor gave Mark a sense of comfort, like a lifeline thrown to a drowning man. But the man's cold professionalism also reminded him of the stakes. This wasn't just about Sarah's affair anymore. It was about uncovering the secrets hidden behind it, and whether those secrets extended deeper than mere infidelity. "Let's get started, Mr. Thompson," Peter said, his voice measured. "You've come to me because you need to know the truth. I can help with that. But I'll be upfront with you. It's not going to be easy, and it may not be pretty." Mark nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. "I need to know if she's been cheating on me. And I need proof. I can't go into this blind." Peter leaned. Back in his chair, his fingers steepled in front of his mouth. "You've come to the right place. I'll get to work right away. But you need to understand something. This will take time. Infidelity isn't something that can always be confirmed immediately. People are good at hiding their tracks. But that's what I do. I dig. I find what others want to keep buried." Mark felt a strange mixture of relief and anxiety. It was like handing over the control of his life to someone else. But at the same time, it felt like the only way forward. He didn't know what he would find, but he had to know. He had to learn the full extent of Sarah's betrayal, whatever it might be. Over the next few weeks, Peter's team kept a low profile as they investigated Sarah's activities. They followed her, monitored her communications, and gathered every scrap of evidence they could. Mark was kept in the loop at all times, but each update only deepened the pit in his stomach. It wasn't long before Peter called him into his office. Again. Mark could tell by the lawyer's serious expression that something significant had surfaced. "Mr. Thompson," Peter said, his voice cold and direct, "we've uncovered more than we expected." Mark's stomach churned as he sat across from Peter. He knew something was coming, but he wasn't prepared for the weight of what Peter was about to reveal. "Your wife's been seeing someone for nearly 6 months, Peter continued. "The man's name is Greg Matthews. I've already found evidence that they've been in contact regularly, and I have photographic proof of them meeting several times over the past few months. This wasn't just a fling. This is an ongoing affair." The words hit Mark like a punch to the gut. Greg Matthews, a name that was all too familiar. He had never suspected it, but the realization came with a rush of pain. Greg was a close colleague of Sarah's, someone who had often come over for dinner, a man Mark had considered a friend. The betrayal cut deeper now, not just because of Sarah's actions, but because of the betrayal from someone he trusted. "How long has this been going on?" Mark asked, his voice barely above a whisper, the words tasting bitter in his mouth. "At least 6 months, Peter replied. "We've gathered detailed records of their communication, as well as surveillance footage of several meetings in private locations. It's clear they've been involved for quite some time." Mark leaned back in his chair, his mind reeling. Wanted to scream, to rage against the unfairness of it all. But deep down, he knew he had to stay composed. There was more at stake now than just his marriage. There was a larger story unfolding, one that involved betrayal on multiple fronts. Peter leaned forward, his expression shifting to something more serious. "I've also dug into Greg's background, and I've found something that might interest you even more. It seems that he has ties to some questionable business dealings, something beyond just personal affairs. I'm still tracing the connections. But there's a possibility that this whole affair could be part of something much bigger than infidelity." Mark's mind raced as Peter's words sank in. Bigger than infidelity? What does that mean? The thought unsettled him. Was Sarah's affair just a symptom of something darker? Was Greg part of something larger? Something dangerous? Mark left the house with a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in days. The weight of the folder in his bag felt both like a burden and a weapon. His first real step toward understanding the full scope of the disaster that had unfolded in his life. As he drove toward Peter's office, his mind was a blur of conflicting emotions: rage, betrayal, confusion, and the faintest spark of resolve. No one had ever told him how devastating discovering a loved one's infidelity could be, especially when it was wrapped up in a larger web of deceit and criminality. Peter was already waiting for him when he arrived, his expression stern, his sharp eyes betraying none of the thoughts running through his head. Mark didn't waste time. He handed the folder over to Peter, watching as the lawyer flipped through the pages. Photographs of Sarah and Greg, text exchanges, the trail of lies that had twisted Mark's world apart. "Everything checks out, I presume?" Mark asked, his voice tight. Peter nodded, his lips thinning as he closed the folder. "Yes, but it's not just about the affair anymore. The money laundering Greg's involved in is extensive. He's connected to people we don't want to mess with, people who wouldn't hesitate to make problems disappear." Mark clenched his jaw. "So it's worse than I thought." Peter leaned forward, his voice low. "Much worse. The moment Greg became involved with your wife, he wasn't just playing a part in her affair. He was bringing her into something far darker. This isn't just personal, it's criminal. And if you confront her about all of this, it's likely she'll deny everything or, worse, blame you for discovering it." Mark could feel the heat rising in his chest as anger boiled over. Blame. Me? He thought. She's the one who chose this path. I didn't come here for advice on what to do with her, Mark said, his voice tight but determined. I need to know how to bring Greg and the people he's working with down. I need leverage. I need to make sure he doesn't just walk away from this. Peter studied him for a moment, then leaned back in his chair. You need more than just legal leverage, Mark. These people play by their own rules. They don't care about the law. But here's what I can do. I can get you access to the financials. I can dig into Greg's business, trace every penny, every transaction, and if we can tie him to something bigger, something more public, then we can expose him. Mark nodded, his mind already racing with plans. He needed Greg's criminal ties to be exposed to the right people. The law could only do so much, but public humiliation, combined with undeniable evidence, could strip away everything Greg had built. He would lose everything, from his business to his reputation. And Sarah? Mark wasn't sure what would happen to her in the wake of all this, but she had made her choices. She had chosen Greg over him. She had chosen to live a lie, and now she had to face the consequences. The lawyer's next words snapped Mark back to the present. But be warned, Mark. There's no turning back once you involve yourself in this. These people don't let things go. They retaliate, and they do it with precision. You can't just go in half-prepared. Mark's gaze hardened. I'm not afraid of them. Peter leaned forward, looking directly into Mark's eyes. You should be, and I mean that seriously. There's a reason I'm advising caution. The more we uncover, the more dangerous this becomes. If Greg knows you're onto him, if he realizes that his affair isn't the only thing you're going after, he'll do anything to stop you. Mark's mind flashed to the nights he had spent laying awake, trying to make sense of the way his life had unraveled. Now he was in the middle of something much larger, and there was no easy way out. He had no choice but to see this through. I'll take that risk, Mark said, his voice steady. I'm not just going to sit back and let them ruin my life, and I won't let Sarah get away with what she's done either. Peter nodded slowly. All right. I'll have my team continue gathering evidence. We'll work fast, but we'll need time to make sure we get everything we need. But you'll have to be careful with your next steps. If you make a wrong move, it could cost you more than you realize. Mark left Peter's office with a newfound sense of purpose. There was no going back now. He had to expose Greg and Sarah and whatever was going on beneath the surface of their affair. Every piece of evidence was another step toward taking down the man who had stolen his wife's loyalty and the people behind the operation he was involved in. Mark's phone buzzed again as he stepped into his car, and he glanced down at the screen. It was a message from Sarah. His heart skipped a beat as he opened it. "Mark, please, I've been thinking about us. I know I've made mistakes, but I need you to hear me out. I'm sorry. Please, just talk to me." The timing of her message sent a cold shiver down his spine. Does she know? Mark's thoughts were a storm as he drove home. The car's tires hummed against the road, a steady rhythm that did little to ease the chaos in his mind. The weight of Peter's warnings clung to him, but so did the crushing need for justice. He wasn't just going to sit back and let Sarah's betrayal define him. He had to act. And with each passing moment, he felt more certain that the path ahead, no matter how dangerous, was the only one he could take. When he arrived at his house, it felt different. The air was heavier, charged with the knowledge of what he now knew. Every corner seemed to whisper of secrets, of things hidden, of lies told. As he stepped inside, the silence greeted him like an old enemy. The house, which had once been a place of warmth, now felt like a cold, impersonal shell. Sarah wasn't home. Mark wasn't sure whether that was a blessing or a curse, but it gave him the space he needed to think. He walked to the living room, running his fingers over the furniture, over the places they had once shared their lives. There was a part of him that wanted to throw it all away, to burn it all down in a fit of rage. But he knew better than to let emotion take control. Instead, he walked over to his study and opened the drawer where he kept the file from Peter. He had reviewed it already, but now, in the quiet of the evening, he felt compelled to go over the details again, just to make sure nothing had slipped through the cracks. As he flipped through the pages, something caught his eye. A name. A connection he hadn't noticed before. There, in the financial records, was an unusual series of transactions between Greg's business and a company called Blackwater Enterprises. The amounts were large, far too large for just a simple affair. Mark's brow furrowed as he examined the transactions further. Blackwater Enterprises wasn't just some random company. He recognized it as a shell corporation that had been linked to money laundering and organized crime. He'd heard about it before, on the news, in whispers around town, but he had never thought it would be tied to Greg. This is bigger than I thought, Mark realized. This is more than just an affair. This is a network of corruption, a system built on lies and deceit, and Sarah is in the middle of it. His heart raced as he began connecting the dots. Greg hadn't just been using Sarah for an affair. He'd been pulling her into something far more dangerous. She wasn't just an accomplice in betrayal. She was potentially a pawn in something criminal. And Mark? Mark had been a fool to believe that everything had just been about love and trust. The phone buzzed again, pulling Mark from his thoughts. It was Sarah's name flashing on the screen. This time she was calling. He stared at the phone for a moment, his mind swirling with possibilities. Do I pick up? He wondered. The thought of hearing her voice, the woman who had so deeply hurt him, almost made him recoil. But he needed to know. He needed to hear what she had to say. It was part of his strategy now. The only way to expose the truth was to get her to reveal it herself. He answered the call. "Mark?" Sarah's voice was soft, almost pleading. "I've been thinking about everything. I know I've made mistakes, but I don't want to lose. You? Please, let's talk." "I'm sorry." Mark could feel the weight of her words, the desperation in her tone. But it felt hollow, as if the apology were rehearsed. He had heard these kinds of words before, hadn't he? Only now, they meant nothing. He kept his voice calm, controlled. I know about Greg. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. He could almost hear her breath catch in her throat. "What are you talking about?" she asked, her voice defensive, her words sharp. "I know about the affair, the money, the dealings with Blackwater Enterprises. I know everything, Sarah." Her silence was deafening. Mark could feel the panic building in her silence. This wasn't the response he had expected, the deflection or denial. This was something different. "Mark," she finally said, her voice low, almost broken. "I never wanted this. I never meant for any of this to happen. Greg is dangerous. He's been using me. I didn't know what I was getting into at first, but now it's too late. I'm in too deep." The confession hit Mark like a slap to the face. He had suspected it, but hearing her admit it was like being hit with the full force of the truth. She wasn't just betraying him emotionally. She had been manipulated, used in a dangerous game. And for a moment, Mark felt a flicker of sympathy. Until the anger came rushing back. "Too late?" Mark repeated, his voice shaking with anger. "You've been lying to me for months, Sarah. You think you can just apologize and everything will be fine? You think that after everything, after what you've done, I'm just going to forget about it? About him? About everything you've dragged me into?" "No, Mark, please," Sarah's voice cracked. The silence after hanging up felt suffocating. Mark stood in his living room, the weight of everything pressing on him. The last words Sarah had spoken echoed in his mind. Her fear, her desperate plea for him to stay safe. Stay safe? The question gnawed at him. Was she truly afraid for him, or was she just trying to save herself? His gut told him she was more deeply entangled than she was letting on, but part of him wanted to believe her, that she was a pawn in this mess, not the mastermind. But Mark had learned the hard way to trust no one, especially not those who had deceived him so completely. His instincts told him he was on the edge of something much bigger than an affair, and the stakes were rising by the minute. He needed answers. He needed to know how deep this went, and he needed to act before Greg or anyone else could silence him. He dialed Peter's number, his fingers trembling with urgency. The phone rang for a moment before Peter answered. "Mark." Peter's voice was steady, but Mark could hear the underlying tension. "I'm still digging through Greg's financials, but I found something else. You're right. This is far bigger than we thought. There's a new player involved, someone higher up in the chain. This isn't just a local operation. We might be dealing with a network of criminals." Mark's pulse quickened. "A network? Who are we talking about here?" "I can't say for sure yet," Peter replied, "but I've traced some transactions to a shadowy figure known as Donovan. Blackwater Enterprises isn't just a front, it's his company, and he's known for having connections with international crime syndicates. This is starting to feel like a much bigger fish than just Greg." Mark felt a chill spread through him. Donovan Black. He had heard the name in passing, whispered about, in underworld circles. Black was notorious for being ruthless, operating with a kind of cold efficiency that made people disappear without a trace. If Black was involved, the danger was far greater than Mark had anticipated. And Greg? He was just a cog in the machine, a pawn in a much larger game. "What's our next move?" Mark asked, his voice tense. "We need to get him exposed. Greg, Black, all of them. I want to bring this whole operation down." Peter hesitated. "Mark, I understand your anger, but we need to be careful. This isn't just about an affair anymore. You're dealing with criminal organizations who don't play by the same rules. If you push too hard, they'll come after you. And Sarah, too. We're not just talking about ruining reputations. We're talking about life and death here." Mark didn't flinch. "I'm not scared of them, Peter. I'm scared of what they've done to my life, and what they're still doing to Sarah. I'm going after them. I'm going to expose them all." There was a long pause on the line. Peter sighed heavily. "I'll get my people to dig deeper into Black's operations. But you have to promise me you won't do anything reckless. The more you know, the more dangerous it becomes. Don't take this lightly, Mark." "I won't," Mark replied, his voice unwavering. "I've been lied to for months, and now I know exactly what I'm dealing with. It's time for Greg and his associates to pay for what they've done." After ending the call, Mark stood in the middle of the room, deep in thought. There was no turning back. This wasn't just a fight to save his marriage anymore. It was a fight for his life, for his future. But he was done playing the victim. He was going to be the one calling the shots from here on out. He picked up the phone again, sending a message to Sarah. "We need to meet. I'm not doing this over the phone. You tell me everything, now." It didn't take long for Sarah to reply. Her message came through almost immediately. "I'll meet you at 7. Please, Mark, let's talk face to face. I'm terrified of what's happening." Mark stared at the screen for a moment, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. Terrified? That was the second time she'd used that word. It only confirmed what he had suspected. Sarah wasn't just a passive participant in this affair. She was in over her head. But the question remained. Had she been playing him from the beginning, or had she been pulled into this world unknowingly? Either way, he wasn't going to let her off the hook. The stakes were too high now. Whatever happened, he would make. Sure, Greg, Sarah, and Donovan Black paid for what they had done to him. As the sun began to set, Mark arrived at the cafe Sarah had chosen to meet. It was a quiet, dimly lit place, perfect for confidential conversations. He sat at a table near the back, his eyes scanning the room. He wasn't sure what he was expecting, but something told him that this conversation wouldn't be like the others. When Sarah walked in, her face was pale, her eyes red. She looked like she hadn't slept in days, and the desperation in her eyes was unmistakable. Mark's heart twisted briefly in sympathy, but he quickly squashed it. As Sarah's words spilled out, Mark could feel the weight of everything crashing down around him. She spoke of Greg's manipulations, of how he had drawn her into his world of deceit, promising her safety and wealth in exchange for her silence and compliance. But the more Sarah confessed, the more it became clear that she had been just another pawn in a much larger game, one far beyond her control. Greg had been more than just a lover. He had been a strategic part of Donovan Black's network, using Sarah's naivety to further his own criminal agenda. Sarah had been unaware of the full scope of Greg's actions at first, but as time went on, she began to notice the subtle shifts in his behavior, the late-night phone calls, the strange meetings, and the sudden influx of cash into their joint accounts. But by then, it was too late to turn back. "I thought I could handle it," Sarah said, her voice shaky. "But Greg, he's dangerous, Mark. I should have left him when I saw the first signs. But I was scared. I thought I could control him, but he's far too involved in things I don't even understand. And now, they're after me. After us." Mark's chest tightened as he processed the information. The more Sarah spoke, the clearer it became that she was no longer the person he thought she was. She had been complicit in her own way, not just in the affair, but in Greg's criminal activities. She had chosen to turn a blind eye, to ignore the warning signs because it was easier than facing the truth. And now that the walls were closing in on them, she was scrambling for an escape. "How deep are you involved, Sarah?" Mark asked, his voice cold. "How much do you really know about this operation?" Tears streamed down her face as she wiped them away with trembling hands. "I don't know everything, but I know enough to be terrified. Greg's not just running a scam. He's laundering money, working with arms dealers, drug cartels, and even politicians. He's connected to Black in ways I can't even begin to comprehend. I never wanted any part of it. I just wanted things to go back to normal." Mark felt a surge of rage but fought to keep his emotions in check. It wasn't the time for anger, it was the time for action. "Where is Greg now?" Mark asked, his voice sharper than before. "I don't know," Sarah admitted, her voice breaking. "He's been gone for days. He told me he was going to lay low for a while, that things were getting too risky, but I haven't heard from him since. I'm afraid something's happened to him, or worse. He's gone into hiding. Mark's mind raced. Greg's sudden disappearance was a red flag. He had either fled or been taken out by someone higher up in the criminal network, perhaps Donovan Black himself. Either way, it meant one thing. Things were escalating, and the clock was ticking. Mark reached into his jacket pocket, pulling out his phone. He had to act fast. If Greg had gone into hiding, it was only a matter of time before he resurfaced. And if he had left town, Mark could be next on the list. But he wasn't going to wait around to be targeted. "I'm going after Black," Mark said, his voice full of resolve. "I don't care how dangerous it is. I'm going to bring him down." Sarah looked horrified. "Mark, no, you don't understand. Donovan Black doesn't just operate in the shadows. He owns them. He's untouchable. If you go after him, they'll kill you. I'm telling you, you can't just walk into this without a plan." "I've got a plan," Mark replied, his voice hard. "You're going to help me. You've been in this world for months. You know how these people think. You can help me get to Greg and to Black." Sarah recoiled, her face pale as she shook her head. I don't know if I can. I'm already in too deep. If I go to them, they'll kill me. And you too. I can't risk it." Mark leaned in, his eyes locking with hers. "You owe me, Sarah. You owe me the truth. This isn't just about saving you or me anymore. It's about stopping them from ruining anyone else's life the way they've ruined ours. If you want a chance to make this right, then you'll help me take them down. You have to." The silence between them stretched, the weight of his words hanging in the air. Finally, Sarah nodded, the fear in her eyes replaced by a flicker of determination. "I'll help you," she whispered. "I'll tell you everything I know. But we need to be careful, Mark. If we do this, we're not just exposing Greg. We're going up against Black's entire operation. We're risking our lives." Mark stood up, his decision final. "I'm willing to risk everything. I won't let them get away with this. They took my life. They took my trust. I'm going to make sure they pay for what they've done." Sarah nodded, tears still fresh on her face, but now mixed with something stronger, perhaps guilt, perhaps resolve. She knew that this was the only way out, the only chance they had at redemption. Later that night, Mark and Sarah sat together in Mark's study, poring over everything Sarah had shared.